Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special edition of the Daily French Show. I am, as usual, your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and today we have a panel of the heavy hitters joining us for a discussion episode of the Daily French Show. We, of course, have current CEO, and he instructed me to introduce him as the lame duck CEO, Frans Cronje, Dr. Frans Cronje. Frans, how are you?
Well, Nick, and you. Nice to be back.
I'm very well, thank you. And we have incoming CEO and new great leader who is looking magnificent and powerful today, Dr. John Endres. John, how are you?
Thank you, Nick. And I hope that you've noted my blue throne, which is, of course, the mark of the leader to have a throne.
Indeed it is. And, of course, we have our sort of wise sage guru from the mountains, Mr. Gabriel Crouse. Gabriel, how are you?
I'm very good. Happy to be here.
So, yeah, it's important that we start off with a bit of frivolity because today we are going to be covering a bit of a heavy subject. And, of course, is the 20-year anniversary of the September 11th attacks on the United States. Events which even I, as an 8-year-old, still remember the day of. I was 8 at the time. And I think anyone who sort of watches the news even a little bit probably remembers at least something of where they were on that day. I know Americans definitely do. And this has had a big impact on the last 2 decades of our lives and on many millions of people around the world. And so let's start off with what the Americans were saying during the remembrance ceremonies, which were held on Saturday. We had a Twitter video put out by President Joe Biden. He basically, it's only 6 minutes long. It was pre-recorded. He basically said, we need to move towards unity in our country and we remember the lives lost. It wasn't a very filled with a huge amount of content. Former President George W. Bush also gave a speech at the remembrance ceremony in New York, where he said various things. Among them was a call for more unity amongst Americans. He said, malign forces seem at work in our common life that turns every disagreement into an argument and every argument into a clash of cultures. He also warned about the growing risk of domestic extremism. And he then went on to say, so much of our politics has become a naked appeal to anger, fear, and resentment. President Donald Trump also, I think, did an event, but I think he just talked to some police nearby. He didn't attend any of the big ceremonies. So, Frans, you were in the US very recently, and you gave us, I think, a really powerful, succinct summary of your thoughts on how America has changed and how 9/11 has changed in America's mind over the last 20 years. Can I start you off there, and let's see where we go?
Well, I was also in America for the 9/11 attacks. I was 100 miles outside of the city when that first plane hit the North Tower. So saw it firsthand, experienced it. It was the most extraordinary thing. People say you'll never forget where you were when you heard, and I remember walking. I was met by a colleague who told me that a plane had crashed in New York City. And I remember I had this impression of a small little sort of commuter plane or something that had somehow lost its way, and walked into an office where there was a television, and we were able to watch the events unfold in real time. So that was quite something. And I remember mid-morning, we happened to be outside and realized that something had changed. And what it was, that corridor, if you know that area of America, is a flight corridor, very heavy air traffic. And I realized what had changed was there were no aircraft, because the FAA had, an hour after the first attack, grounded all aircraft or told them to land at the nearest airports and redirected international flights to other countries, even turned around some that were over the Atlantic. And we sat that evening in a little bar and watched President Bush's address to the country. I think it was 8:30. And I thought he was excellent. And he was very calm and he was very considered. And he said that this was an attempt to frighten America. And he had a line about destroying steel and concrete, but that the resolve of Americans would be unbroken, and that they had been attacked because it was the bastion of freedom and democracy in the world, and that could never be weakened. And,
if I could read those exact lines specifically, these acts have shattered steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve. America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world, and no one will keep that light from shining.
So to see that live was something. I mean, we sat at the sort of bar counter, as you'd imagine in a film, with the TV on and everyone observing this. And the mood was one of great national unity. It was real cross-partisan lines. Mr. Bush had great support. And it was, it was quite inspiring actually to see a people come together like that, which is bookended by, I've recently returned from America. I've been there for a month and visited New York and Washington, D.C. And I don't think it is that anymore. It's that resolve that cannot be broken, I think has been broken. I was there for the exit from Afghanistan. So that was, historically, those are the two bookends. And saw Mr. Biden's various comments on that. And saw the partisan approach to national security questions and how that united position of 22 years ago had been very much eroded, perhaps to a far greater extent than many of the administration of that initial era had thought possible. And it's a very sad thing, and it's a very concerning thing for the sort of cause of freedom and liberty in the world, Nick.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think it would have been easy on September 12th, 2001, to have predicted that 20 years later, this is kind of how America would view itself and how the world would be looking at it and how America's prestige and things would be dented. John, you had some thoughts on sort of the phase of history that this created and maybe what comes next. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, Nick, the idea is that the 1990 effectively marked a very important point in history with the fall of communism, the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. It really changed the way I think that many people in the West and probably also in the East Bloc saw the way the world was set up. And that was encapsulated, I think, in Fukuyama's essay on the end of history, where the idea that he promoted was that liberal democracy effectively had won the battle of ideas and had shown its superiority in contest, and would therefore ultimately end up being the political system that was going to spread throughout the world and establish itself as the only practical alternative to the various political systems that have existed in the past. And I think that sort of idea was able to continue for about a decade until the 11th of September 2001. And I think with the very crash of those planes into those towers, that idea was confronted with ugly reality, which is that there are other systems that are opposed to liberal democracy and that have ways of asserting their contestation of that idea in very visceral and very real ways. And what was interesting about the event, I think, is that the battle of ideas as a concept seems quite abstract, and it is something very theoretical. But when you see it expressed in such undeniably physical terms that it cannot be contested, it really changes the mindset. And I think at the time, probably many people didn't realize it yet, but that marked the end of that period, of that 1990 to 2000 decade, to 2001 decade, during which many people were hopeful that liberal democracy and freedom was winning throughout the world. And the interesting thing that happened after that, after 9/11, I think, is that the contest was carried out into the world in the form of various interventions by Western powers, who I think still believed that liberal democracy was the model to espouse and to pursue, and try to spread it effectively, no matter how, even with very considerable use of force of arms. But what was revealed, I think, is that you cannot really spread those ideas very easily, and it's very difficult to carry them throughout the world using such violent means. And the events now, the fall of Afghanistan, I think, marks another endpoint of a certain period. That's those 20 years, effectively, and something else will now come out of this. I'm not exactly sure what that is going to be, but I think that liberal democracy, far from being able to assert itself through the use of huge amounts of money and military force, is probably even weaker now and even more skeptical about its own strengths than it was at the beginning of that period. And I think that the confidence with which countries are able to promote their ideas will be quite a determinant in how successfully they can do that. And that is where there are some big question marks over the ability of the West to buy into their own values, to be confident in their values, and to promote their own values with exactly that self-assurance. So I think that we're entering a new period now. Not exactly sure how it's going to play out, but it's certainly worth thinking about and exploring.
I think another important thing that the 9/11 attacks really heralded for the world was how sort of technology had changed the game. I mean, Al-Qaeda was an organization that could not have existed in any time except the modern age. It's an organization that is very decentralized. It used things like the internet and cell phones to cause an enormous amount of damage. And if you think about the sort of amount of money spent and the value they got from it, Al-Qaeda basically bought some flight manuals and box cutters and managed to turn the whole world on its head and shift the world in a different direction by hijacking those planes. So, Gabriel, there's a lot, I think, to be said on what Frans and John have just said. Your thoughts on that, and also, I mean, this is a question perhaps we can maybe come to a bit later, but is the war on terror over, and if so, who won
it? Yeah. So I think not. I think I'll open by just adding to what's been said with a historical rhyme across time. The England, the term Little Englander, as far as I can tell, really became popular in the late 19th century. And the United Kingdom had kind of become this, the British Empire had become this thing upon which the sun never sets. And in the 20th century, this sort of period that John's talking about concluding with 1989, for most of the 20th century, if you were someone who believed in freedom, in voting, in the rule of law, rather than the rule of men, you were often with your back up against the wall, against Soviets, against Nazis, in World War I, against emperors. But in the 19th century, it did seem like this idea was spreading and doing well, and a lot of it under the aegis of the British Empire. By the end of the 19th century, by the end of the 1800s, the term Little Englander came to describe those people who thought, no, really, we've spent much too much time, much too much blood and treasure trying to spread this idea of freedom. It's a very bad idea. What we should do is tend our own garden, focus on that, and it'll all be much better. I find that period curious because it's just at that time, as far as I can tell, that British imperialism goes from a mixed bag with a lot of good sides to taking on its worst racist overtones, to really curtailing labor markets, to becoming quite brutal. It's at that point that the white man's burden becomes the sort of slogan of British imperialism. And instead of spreading freedom, they sort of spread, they toxify some of the regions that they're touching. The Anglo-Boer War is, in fact, an important turning point in that progression. And the sort of initiation of concentration camps and so on is a portentous moment with new technologies of what war will then look like in the 20th century. It's a strange thing. The Little Englander impulse is at once good and bad, and coincides with the beginning of a very dark period in history. I think right now we're seeing the little American moment. Little Americans are disappointed at the ejection from Afghanistan. They are appalled at the visions of people falling off of aeroplanes, so desperate are they to leave. But they're delighted, ultimately, that America has left, because they believe that America has been involved much too much around the world, especially in the Middle East, and that really it needs to come home, have some me time, and then it'll all be okay. I worry that if the rhyme continues in its former fashion, that American internalism, exceptionalism, and introversion creates a power vacuum, which is filled by B-class powers that compete to be superpowers in such a fashion that the new technologies of the 21st century really get a run on the ground for our money and for our blood. The second point that I want to make is, if that sounds too extreme, well, let's limit ourselves as Henry Kissinger does on exactly this question of what it is to win the war on terror. Henry Kissinger, one of the great, although extremely disturbing, terrific, I think one would say in a word, one of the terrific statesmen of the 20th century, penned in The Economist an idea of mission creep that goes beyond merely the practical in terms of Afghanistan. He says there are two kinds of mission creep that America suffered. The one is political, the other is military. In both axes, America in Afghanistan failed to set proper limits. Their goals were far too expansive. In military terms, he argues that it is impossible to eradicate the Taliban or eradicate violent Islamic fundamentalism, that the target should have been to manage it instead. And that was an achievable target. And had that been the target and had it been achieved, we'd be in a different position. Politically, he says the goal in Afghanistan became to turn it into Sweden or South Korea overnight. And that was an unachievable goal. And that America should have been less ambitious. And to put it in my own words, should basically have said, we're going to make sure you can buy for 2 and sell for 3. That's what we're going to make sure. You're not allowed to bonk people on the heads to death to take their stuff. We're just going to make sure if you want to buy an egg for 2 whatevers and sell it for 3 whatevers, that's your right. We're going to help you to do that. You want to have dictators, you want to have this, you want to have that, go for it. But as time goes by, as you encourage entrepreneurship, as free markets cement good attitudes and create dynamic social flows, it'll be much easier for the sort of democratic values will follow in much the way that they really did in South Korea, a dictatorship under some form of American occupation for over 3 decades, which then became the grand flower, I think, of democracy in the East. Although Japan has done very well too. There are such success stories. That didn't happen. America wanted all full-on democracy now or broke. It wanted complete destruction of the Taliban now or broke, setting itself up in that regard for failure. And I think that the lesson that I draw from this is that America is going to have to be more limited in its ambitions, but that it's very dangerous for it to be so limited that it reverts to little Americanness of the kind that would unplug it from the rest of the world.
So yeah, this is I think that's pretty interesting view that you've laid out, and I want to get now into the question of how did it sort of come to this psychologically for the Americans. I think Gabriel and I on our show Two Crickets and a Thorn Tree have talked a little bit about perhaps the more you could call it operational side, on the sort of Afghanistan side of how it came to this. But I want to maybe delve into the psychology of America and how it, in a sense, kind of defeated itself. So I'll go to that with you, Frans. I will say on Afghanistan that my hope is that the seeds that were planted by the Americans, as badly as they were planted, perhaps may yet bear some fruit, because hopefully the Taliban are going to have a difficult time imposing their view on that country, considering how it's changed in the last 20 years. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. Frans, how did America defeat itself in so many ways?
There's a lot to say here. Maybe we must see if we've got time to come back to the war in Afghanistan too, which I think was a great success for America, one of its most successful ventures. and that Henry Kissinger has always been wrong about political or religious ideologues. He's never understood them. He's never understood them on China. He didn't understand them there either, and he's wrong. Lots of Afghanistan was a great success for the US and the US military. We'll get back to that maybe. What has happened? I have a theory. You know parts of it. I try and share it with you in a coherent way. I think the experience of the 9/11 attack, and later, to a lesser extent, various attacks on Israel, convinced the sort of enemies of freedom in the West that Western democracies were impervious to external attack. Militarily, they were just too strong. You built this internal resolve after 9/11 in America, and the Israelis became better and better, and with the Americans developed the technology to shoot down missiles and mortars and all sorts of things fired at them. You couldn't attack them from outside. And so the strategy changes from the hard external attack to the soft internal attack, a virus almost of sorts, very similar to COVID, but a virus that would disable those institutions from within by dividing their populaces on key questions of economic policy and national security in order to weaken them so that they became vulnerable to future attacks. And a present-day case study of that would be critical race theory and the damage that it does to competitiveness. And if there's anything that's disturbing about visiting the United States today, is the number of communities in which that theory has a degree of traction, very often at odds with what the community would want for itself. And I am certain that in the fullness of time, we will come to learn that the Iranians and the Chinese and the Russians began to see separately for themselves a great advantage in weakening the West via these much softer, much more insidious ideological attacks from within, and that lesson was learned in part through the experience of the reaction to 9/11 in the West, and the experience of the Israelis over the equivalent 20 years. And that is what explains the divisions within, because that consensus on national security is gone. And the consensus on the kinds of economic policies that made Western democracies the bastions of civilization that Bush spoke of 20 years ago are being challenged. And those challenges are being executed through the very institutions of democracy and at the behest of the citizens of the freest and most prosperous countries in the world. And that is my answer, the beginning of the answer to your very good question.
So, John, I want to get your thoughts on that. I think there's sort of two issues emerging here. One is, how do democracies deal with kind of authoritarian impulses within themselves? Are they always going to be weak to this kind of internal subversion and weakening of their own institutions? Or is this particular to what's been going on now? And also the second one is this question about whether Kissinger was right. I think it was General, what's his name, McMaster, who I read a book from recently, put it quite well when he said, he put the sort of Kissinger theory quite well when he said, during the Bush administration, American foreign policy was a bit like Icarus. It flew too high, too close to the sun, melted. The wings melted and it sort of fell apart. And during Obama, it flew too close to the sea and it hit the waves and it was not ambitious enough. So your thoughts on that, and also the previous question I hinted at.
Well, I think that on Kissinger, I think he got China wrong. Where the theory was that if
he thinks he got China wrong. Sorry,
he does. He thinks it as well. Exactly. So I mean, the idea was that China was communist and it was authoritarian, and that if you could get it to open up first and to develop economically, then eventually democracy would follow. And that doesn't seem to have been the case. And so I think that's certainly a black mark against his name in the the book of political predictors, and that he
Well,
might
to
well
be
have.
fair, if I may
Yes.
interrupt you, John, to be fair, we don't know how the story ends yet because
Yes.
history is a very, very, very long time.
It's too soon to tell, exactly. And in the long run, we're all dead. So he might still be proven right. Who knows? But certainly in this time period that we find ourselves in, I think he was wrong on that. And I think he might also be wrong on the other issues. And as for the question of democracies, I think that I think that in the 1990s, there was a sense of complacency that crept in about the achievements of the West, and it was able to say, we beat the commies, we are the victors, we're the strong ones, we made it. And I think that the West was at risk of letting its guard down, and then got a very rude wake-up call on the September the 11th attacks. An interesting response to that, however, is that firstly, you get the rallying around the flag effect. So people will start to support the leader, will start to support the army, because they want to defend their country, and they'll accept quite a lot of impositions in order to do that. And one area where they do that, of course, is the area of security, where this trade-off between security and freedom then becomes weighted, I think, in the area of security, and the willingness to accept sort of quite strong impositions on personal freedoms. The Department of Homeland Security, I think, in the United States, Guantanamo Bay, etc., are examples where a democratic state, I think, was willing to bend the rules quite far in order to ensure the safety of its citizens. And citizens were willing to allow that trade-off. And I think that really eventually then also leads to the weakening of the system, because then, of course, you get a very strong anti-authoritarian impulse, and you make it harder to maintain cohesion within society. And so the division in American society, I think, is also driven by this, that you had the rallying around the flag, then you had the acceptance of the authoritarian impulse, then you had the rebellion against the authoritarian impulse, and the questioning of authority. And ultimately, I think the United States hasn't found a good answer to that yet, of what its identity and its involvement in the rest of the world should be. You also get this effect that you might not be interested in events in the world, or might want to withdraw from them into splendid isolation, but the rest of the world is still interested in you. And I think that drives the cycle of interventionism versus isolationism, which seems to go, in decade-long periods from the one extreme to the other. And we're probably at the beginning of an isolation cycle now, but eventually it'll turn back into interventionism because the world comes knocking at the door.
So I think the National Review writer Charlie Cook described that thought quite well. He said the reason that America has an incoherent foreign policy is because the American people are incoherent on foreign policy. They want to intervene everywhere to save every group of people from destruction, but at the same time, they also don't want to spend any money or lose any soldiers doing it. And these are completely incompatible goals, which result in an America that is very confused and doesn't really know what to do. Gabriel, your thoughts on that, and your thoughts on how America came to this point where it was sort of defeating itself?
Yeah, I mean, I think it came to this point right at the beginning of America. Let's go even further back in history to a possibly apocryphal conversation between John Adams, the first deputy president of the United States, the first vice president, and Thomas Jefferson. Both went on to become presidents of the United States. Both were founding fathers. And both spent some time in Paris. Of course, the American Revolution, the American War of Independence, again, its decolonization project, throwing off the yoke of King George, was successful. And then it was quickly asked whether it would like to join the French people in throwing off the yoke of Louis. And Jefferson and John Adams had very different ideas about this. And in one of their last conversations before their friendship went on ice, John Adams said, well, at least let's toast to our revolution. Sorry, Jefferson says, let's toast to our revolution. And Adams says, which one? Meaning, are you talking about the French one or the American one? And Jefferson replies, but aren't they the same thing? Now, that idea of America's revolution being every revolution that every revolution that throws off autocracy, that brings in the rule of law, free markets, and democracy is an American revolution, is as old as America is.
Which the French Revolution did not do.
And there have been some really rubbish revolutions. And it's probably a very good thing that America did not enjoin itself in that, because it would have been bankrupted and fallen on its head. So I think it is an inherent problem in a democracy. I think people are just confused in the kind of way that gives rise to this. But I think that there are further particulars, and they have to do with a breakdown in America's political system, which, yeah. So I mean, I think France is right to say that Tehran, Moscow, Beijing see a vulnerability and have all been and will all continue to try to take advantage of it. But I think that vulnerability has already been there, and that Americans have been ripping America apart themselves. And that in the more recent historical cycle, that process began after World War II. America was the most united around the flag at that point. And then you see after South Korea, that war goes well. Vietnam's very divisive. The hippie revolution, very divisive. Authoritarian pushbacks, Nixon, very divisive. Reagan, very divisive. You know, America can't really, the pendulum swings start getting wider and wider from one extreme to another. And in a sense, John speaks of us entering an isolationist period, or America entering an isolationist cycle. I think that's right. And then the question is, well, what's most likely to eject it from that cycle and return it to interventionism? And there, I think it will have to be a major challenge, and a challenge that at this stage one can only really see coming from Beijing, not, I think, from the Middle East. I think, in other words, that Biden has, in one way, continued Obama's legacy, although this is where Biden and Obama disagreed the most. And that is, Obama spoke about the pivot, the American pivot in geopolitics, trade, and military, from the Atlantic corridor into the Pacific corridor. And I think that this pushes America more in that direction than it's ever been before. It's creating this power vacuum in the Middle East. Its attention, surely, when it does come back, will be focused on the Far East.
So I was listening to, I'm thinking about the seeds of how all of this was planted, and I agree with you that there's a long tail to this. I was listening.
You can see our supreme leader, hey?
Yes.
I just want to say something that Nick won't say, because he said it earlier. It's very good, and Gabriel can answer it. Nick said earlier, I don't know if you were on yet, that 9/11 might have represented the peak of perhaps post-war American unity. Would you agree with that?
So I would say post-war American unity is like, if the peak is there, it comes back down, and then it comes back up to a kind of peak, but not as high as it was in the 50s. And part of the reason I say that is you mentioned critical race theory, is America's universities response to September 11th, and its intellectual response was in some sense a soul searching. And I mean that quite literally. America, the conversation about atheism is one of the first upshots to, I think, really cover the Anglosphere coming out of America. There was this question, are we fighting a Christian war against Is this Christendom against Islam? Is this secularism against fundamentalism? And that split America very hard. And people who resent George Bush, if you ask them one line on George Bush towards the end of his presidency, I remember seeing a poll on this, it was that he called fetuses snowflakes and abolished sort of fetal research because of a kind of Christian attitude that the secular left was appalled by. And that kind of religious iconoclasm was not a big deal in America in the 90s. It became a huge deal in America in the 2000s.
It's very important what Gabriel says there. I was hoping this would come up, that predating 9/11, you have the entryism of the evangelicals into Republican politics. and that certainly, I think, sets up a kind of counter reaction amongst many middle of the road Republicans before you even get to the reaction from the left. And I remember Bush ends his address that evening, the one I watched in the bar, with Psalm 23. Now, as you set off to war in the Middle East, with Psalm 23 ringing in your ears, that was a potent. There was a potency to that.
So I wanted to talk a little bit, perhaps, about the origins of defeat from the American, where they came in on the American left. So I was listening to some podcasts recently, one of them by the people from Commentary magazine, who are one of the last public defenders of American interventionism, like in the US, that are sort of not very qualified about their defense of it. And they were talking about, one of them was talking about how he was kind of a sort of apolitical center-left guy when 9/11 happened. And he lived in New York, and the sense among a lot of his friends was sort of, well, we had it coming, didn't we? Because we didn't care about the outside world. It's quite interesting that we talk about entering an isolationist period now. The criticism from the left at the time was that America doesn't take interest in the outside world, and that's why 9/11 happened. And when America does take an interest, it just treats the world like a bank to withdraw money or resources from. And I see so much of what's happened in Afghanistan as America still being kind of caught in the framework, the paradigm of Vietnam. It sort of now almost sees every conflict as that, which is that if you don't win it quickly, it's a hopeless last war that's doomed to failure. And there were so many echoes in the American anti-war movement against particularly the Iraq War and the Vietnam War that I saw. I don't know if they were real, but that was the impression that I always got. And it's somewhat horrifying that the fall of Kabul in Afghanistan looked an awful lot like the fall of Saigon in 1975 in South Vietnam. John, your thoughts on the theory I just laid out, and then we'll get back to something Frans said a little bit after you're done.
Well, I think there's something very intriguing in that, which is the kind of timelines that you work on as a nation when you think about your role in the world. And the United States, I think, has had the reputation for being more engaged with short-termism rather than being in it for the long haul. And some of the examples you mentioned, I think, confirm that. It ranges all the way from the business community, where the chasing of quarterly profits, it sometimes distorts markets quite significantly. That is something that, for example, European family-owned businesses like to point out. And they'll say, this is crazy. You need to invest. You need very large investments that will only pay off over years or even decades. And you can't do that if you're always chasing quarterly profits. And the same, I think, also applies in international relations, where those sort of really quick successes that you get a quick payoff from after a few years are very, very rare. And very often it is much more a question of having a very long-term perspective and being able to stick things out and having a clear vision of what you're doing and where you're heading. And again, if we now think of the conflicting powers in the world, I think that Beijing has a far more long-term perspective than Washington has. And that probably puts it in quite a strong position, unless Washington manages to extend its time horizons and think ahead a lot further than it is at the moment. And I think that is going to be one of the determining factor of what happens in the coming years, is who's able to think through the long game and engage for the long game and stick with the plan.
So 2 questions on that, Frans. The first one is, do you agree with John on that point? Is it, I've heard an alternative theory that authoritarian systems look like they have the ability to plan for the future and have these grand schemes, but ultimately on the inside, they're just as chaotic, if not more, than democratic systems. And the leaders of those systems are often sort of standing on very shaky ground, and they constantly have to negotiate with various political factions within their own parties and move around there. And as a result, they actually have to kind of take foreign politics much or less as it comes, rather than planning too much for the future. What do you make of that theory? And do you agree with John, Frans?
No, I think the authoritarian ideologues, whether political or religious, have the advantage here. and that free societies suffer from the democratic deficit, that their governments have to pay attention to what their people feel and want and believe. So if you can turn the people against an issue, then the government has to move as well. And that's not true for the Iranians or Russia to a lesser extent, and China to really no extent at all. And there's an important parallel here to Vietnam. I mean, your comment's very good. You said it was the peak of post-war. By that, I take it to mean post-1950s unity in America. But the same thing has happened in Vietnam. The American war really falls apart in the aftermath of the Tet Offensive, which is peculiar because Tet had been a major victory for the Americans. The North Vietnamese have thrown everything they can, and they've suffered horrendous losses. And when General Westmoreland says, he's recently been on a tour of America saying we're winning, and then Tet comes and these terrible images on American television screens turn public opinion. When Westmoreland says to Washington, this looks bad, but it's actually not bad at all for us. We are in command. We can control this thing. We just need more troops. The political establishment shuts him down and says, no, you can't have it. And the reason is that the war has been lost. The famous quote is not in the jungles of Southeast Asia, but on the streets of Washington and in the living rooms of America. Afghanistan, like Vietnam, was from just a military and strategic perspective up until the point of the Trump administration trying to exit. Remember, the exit is one of the few Trump policies that the Biden administration does not reverse. Because Trump has set this up to begin with, this exit. And so we talk about that. But the exit comes on the back of great strategic successes for the Americans. There are very few troops left in Afghanistan. Gabriel perhaps knows the exact number. I think around 2,000 or so.
2,800, I think.
Yeah, it was 2,500 at the end there, but for I think the last 5 years or so, it was less than 8,000.
Yeah.
American
there hasn't been
another 8,000 coalition.
There hasn't been an American combat death for a year.
18 months, yeah.
Afghan women are playing sport.
Yeah.
No.
Afghanistan played in the Cricket World Cup.
There is. How can you see the Taliban cutting the ribbon at the next Soccer World Cup? It's not possible. And given what the Americans inherited at the point of the invasion, from the perspective of urban Afghanistan, if there is such a thing, certainly Kabul, enormous progress has been made in providing to Afghan citizens some of the freedoms and liberties that are taken for granted in the Western world. And all of that is now surrendered and given back to the Taliban again. And the reason is that at the end of Vietnam, after Tet, American opinion is turned against the war, I think in the face of the facts on both occasions. Now some of my senior colleagues who are good at these things speak very cleverly and well on how Soviet agitation and propaganda is important in turning public opinion in America against Vietnam. And that's where the great loss happens. And the thesis I work on now and hope to do in the future is that a similar thing is happening to Western democracies again. This time the centerpiece is CRT or something equivalent. And that is why the American government, state administration, 2 in a row, the most divisive 2 you can think of, the Trump of the past and the Biden of today, one thing in common, 1 or 2 things, but one of the prominent ones is to get out of Afghanistan. And that is because of how public opinion in America had been turned. And it's the answer to your question, that fundamentally free societies don't have the same staying power as autocratic ones, because sometimes they need to turn in the face of even greatly misguided and manipulated public opinion.
So you actually sort of preempted my question there, which was I was going to ask. You said the war in Afghanistan was a great success, and I think you've answered that. But just before we move on to I think Gabriel next, do you have anything more to say just on that point about how Kissinger is always wrong?
Well, I mean, you can't say it's a black spot, John Endres. I mean, if you are the leading foreign policy man in America and you get China wrong, that's not a black spot. That is a catastrophic failure of.
It's a black hole.
It's a black hole. It's rather serious. I mean, you know, what matters? It's like getting the ANC wrong on South Africa, or the Nats wrong, or whatever it is. So I think that's a serious failure. Maybe one thing in the time we've left we can talk a bit about is something that's completely missed, and that's the Taliban versus Al-Qaeda, because these were two very different organizations, and they're too often conflated. But it was, in a sense, an oddity that an organization like Al-Qaeda pulled off this attack. I mean, Al-Qaeda was an aristocratic group of Saudis and Egyptians in the main, very wealthy, who wanted to wage global jihad and attack the world and America. The Taliban were provincial, sort of country sort of bumpkins by comparison, really only wanted to carve out a sort of Islamic emirate in Afghanistan. And I think the Americans now and the Trump era hoped, I mean, they sprung one of the leading current Taliban leaders out of prison in Pakistan to take over, because this man was so keen on making a deal with the Americans in order to go back to what the Taliban had become in the aftermath of the Soviet withdrawal in 1989, which was the sort of rural-based, fairly strict country bumpkins controlling that society. But even now, and here certainly, and in America, the idea of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda are conflated, and they need to be entirely separated to understand what has just happened. It hasn't been here a surrender to terrorism as much as a surrender of the prospects of Afghans to live with some of the freedoms and liberties that people enjoy in the West.
It's quite an interesting point you bring up there. I think I think I'm correct in saying, and I've been using this for a while, that technically Al-Qaeda is a subdivision of the Taliban, because when the Taliban take over Afghanistan, the aristocrats that you described are so impressed by their program of harsh Islam that they actually kind of say, we're going to swear allegiance to the Taliban and kind of become your international arm. And manage to somehow unite, as you say, a very local focused group with this sort of international jihad, which is shall we say, a bit more ambitious.
Well, even within Al-Qaeda circles, Al-Qaeda doesn't really have, it's not an organization in the sense that Westerners would understand it. It's sort of a loose affiliation of billionaires and millionaires.
It's like a McDonald's franchise system.
Like McDonald's franchise, yeah. Even within those networks, there was hesitance about the plan of 9/11, given what the consequences would be. And for much of the Taliban leadership, the same would have been true as well, was true. The Taliban leadership weren't entirely aware of what was being planned, although they carried, when Bush in that same speech said, and who harbored them, I think the Taliban thought, oh no, this is not going to be good at all, which it wasn't for them, but they have returned. But no, two entirely different organizations with entirely different objectives, to such a point that and I went through some of my notes of the past on this morning, of a chap who regards the Al-Qaeda as being quite racist in how it regards the Taliban and Afghans in general, as being of such low birth and of such an uneducated state, which isn't true for the Taliban core, that they aren't really worthy of being taken seriously. So that distinction needs to be made properly. And
I think that kind of explains the split between Al-Qaeda and ISIS, because ISIS is more continued on that disdain for the Taliban, kind of, these people are backward savages who don't know anything about Islam. And Al-Qaeda
sellouts who would negotiate with the Americans when your purpose in the world is to kill every single American and start in America if you can and never ever stop and let nothing get in your way. The ISIS worldview and the Al-Qaeda worldview are much closer to each other than the Taliban. The Taliban and the United States have far more in common now, common ground, common interest, than Al-Qaeda would with the Taliban or ISIS. In the main, there are exceptions. A very important core of the current Taliban, called Al-Haqqani network, around a sort of aristocratic of sorts family. Now there, if you dig, you may find ties to Al-Qaeda or sympathies more strongly. But on the whole,
I believe the Taliban have appointed the head of the Haqqani network as their Minister of the Interior or whatever. I can't remember. It's one of those positions. They certainly believe that that despite the differences, the alliance is worth keeping in check.
Well, they're a bit afraid of the consequences of not keeping such an alliance as well. Yes.
John, you look like you may have a comment on this, or should I move on to Gabriel now?
So a quick aside on something that Frans said earlier, which is the process of democratization and denazification of Germany after the Second World War was successful. It was done by a democracy, the United States. Why did it succeed if other such processes don't work? What was different? Any idea, Frans?
Well, I mean, we stuck with it. The world stuck with it, firstly. I mean, Germany was already a very learned, most learned society of art and culture, music and all those things. So it wasn't, Afghanistan, you need to advance at 1,400 years to get to the same point, which is difficult to do in 20 years in Kabul. So that's, I think, the main difference. And so the institutional memory, that all existed. The support never stopped for it. The establishment later of global bodies, NATO and the like. And the only reason Afghanistan is going to revert and Kabul is going to revert is because of the exit. And on my recent visit, I met a very interesting group of people, not widely known, who are pushing an idea called just war. And the idea I can't speak for them, but the idea broadly is that it's good and right for the free world to use its military and treasure, as Gabriel said earlier, to actually go to war to liberate poor societies and unfree ones from authoritarian regimes. And it's not only morally right, but it is in the best long-term strategic interests of the free world to do so. And the only reason Afghanistan and Kabul are going to revert is because the support structures for their liberalization, which was in relative sense well advanced, was withdrawn very quickly.
I think there's another two reasons in Germany, if I can just jump in there. One of which was that I think denazification was pursued with great determination and very few apologies. So, the education and democracy was, just put out there after the war with no excuses given, no justifications. This is how it's going to be, and you're going to stop being Nazis now. And the other factor, I think, was the threat from the Soviet Union, because you had East Germany, of course, across the border, and that very big threat, which West Germans probably perceived, and they were quite grateful to have the Americans on their side, and were willing to accept their values in the face of a great enemy. And that didn't quite apply in Afghanistan. But I think your point is well made about sticking with it for the long haul and committing the resources that are needed to achieve that sort of change.
Indeed, I believe there are still American troops in Germany, and there are more American troops in Germany than I think were in Afghanistan for very long stretches of time. Before you get in there, Gabriel, I also want to say that we are forgetting the two other examples of democratization. One, which Gabriel brought up earlier, which is of course South Korea, and Japan, which, I mean, both of those countries did not, shall we say, have long histories of democracy. I think Japan had been a democracy for about 5 years or something in the 1920s, and Korea had no history of democracy, and yet they eventually became two of the world's most successful democracies. And that is an interesting counterpoint. Gabriel, your thoughts?
Yes. France did a very terrible thing, which is he introduced me to a wonderful book by the South Korean ambassador to South Africa, which debunks the first idea that you have to have a literate population in order to have this democratization process get going. The South Koreans' literacy rates were sort of, let's say, 30%. At the very highest by some measures, and probably closer to about 5% once the Americans had but once the North and the South had finished their war together, and they'd emerged as a Japanese colony into a sort of confusing unit in the Chinese Civil War. So I do think that the main things are sticking with it, investing resources, and not apologizing. I think that there's one more ingredient to add. What worked in Japan, what worked in South Korea, what worked in Germany, and what hasn't worked in Afghanistan, and to a large extent has not worked in Iraq, and what certainly did not work in Vietnam, which is just doing it right, sticking to your own rules, not letting corruption get in the way. So I mean, one point is that I think there's something about the anti-war movement. There's something about the sort of bomb movement. America bombs Hiroshima, Nagasaki with nuclear weapons, and Americans push back against that. I'm not sure that the pushback makes sense. Retrospectively, as hard as I can to look into the military history, that just seemed to be the route that not only saved the most American lives, but also saved the most Japanese lives. It did not it did not plant a seed of permanent resentment on the part of the Japanese. In fact, it was the last blow, which then set up the preconditions for a flowering democracy in Japan. Likewise, very harsh treatment in Dresden, Düsseldorf, very no-holds-barred treatment at the Nuremberg trials did not create resentful Germans. It created a German population that was very willing to democratize. And yet there was this pushback from Americans. They were like, don't be too harsh, don't be too mean. This was too violent. This was too extreme. You can't do that. I think some of that is just a knee-jerk reaction to seeing all this power, feeling part of this power and feeling very nervous about it. So I think that there's a natural pushback that's going to come from inside a democracy like America when it exerts force. The question is, can they get bites? Can they get traction inside the civil service, inside the military hardcore, and inside the political establishment? In the case of Vietnam, they could. It wasn't, the Pentagon Papers were not Soviet propaganda. There absolutely was Soviet propaganda which wrecked the conversation. But really, it was the Washington Post and the New York Times releasing military intelligence that said, X about what would be needed in order to maintain the war in Vietnam. And then briefings at the very same time saying Y, saying exactly the opposite to X in terms of what would be needed to win the war. Those were the revelations of the Pentagon Papers, that the Pentagon had been allowing Washington to tell lies to the American public about what it would take to win Vietnam. And when that came out, it made it impossible to trust the generals who then go on a tour and say after the tele, look, this looks bad, but really this is not as bad as it looks, and you should trust us. That trust had been broken by telling lies. There's a very similar analog in the Middle East theater in the last 2 decades, which is America's invasion of Iraq. The precondition of that invasion, the story of that invasion, is inextricable from a claim that weapons of mass destruction are housed in Iraq and that America must preemptively invade that country, depose Saddam Hussein, in order to get rid of the weapons of mass destruction, and then go about either retreating or nation building or whatever. When those claims turn out not only to be false, but to be knowably false at the time, to be deceptions of the body politic, you say, well, here, some portion of the country is always going to rebel and say, no, we're expressing too much force. Now you're giving them a real thing to rebel against, which is a government that has misled its people. And I think that ingredient is so clearly present in the Middle East theater. And it just seems to be conspicuous largely by its absence from the German, South Korean, and Japanese theaters. And I think that's an important one to emphasize, because insofar as America is still plugged into the rest of the world, insofar as America maintains and increases its intervention elsewhere, this is another side of what it has to learn, is that it must, the best defense against overreacting the voting population is really to hold back on deception and outright corruption. It seems pretty simple, but I think it is a serious sense in which America failed in Iraq. And what's the connection between Iraq and Afghanistan? Well, Americans feel frustrated at the war wariness really sets in with frustrations in Iraq. Afghanistan has a surge in the Obama era that is debatable, both from a military perspective and from a population perspective. But a lot of people are willing to get behind that. Surging in Iraq is what, this is what drives, I think, Americans really mad, is that we're stuck in this embarrassment and there's no way out of it. And I think that makes it easier for both Biden and Trump to say, guys, you're talking too much, you're thinking too much. Here's what we need to do. Pull out, focus on ourselves, focus on our own working class, just leave the rest of the world alone. And that's the dangerous position that we're in.
Yeah, I'd restricted myself to Afghanistan for the reasons Gabriel has set up. There are American troops in Iraq, aren't there? No, I think.
Yeah, there's a small number, I think, mostly special forces.
I think roughly the same number as have recently left Afghanistan.
I'm not sure. I'll need to look it up.
That makes Gabriel's point even sharper.
Yes.
So
I mean,
right.
and the follow up on that is like, is it clear that America is cleaning up house? Has it made any changes that make those kinds of machinations and interventions less likely? No. If anything, America seems to be leaning further the other way, because it seems to be institutionalizing the very kind of blinkered ideological frameworks that make bad and dishonest state action possible, right? So in Vietnam, there's a kind of McCarthyist, we can just, whatever it takes to beat the communists, lie to your own people to beat the communists, okay, just go ahead and do it. That McCarthyism seems to infect some part of the Pentagon, which then allows it to lie to its people. This then gets exposed by the Washington Post and the New York Times. That creates the revelations. In the Bush era, there is a little bit of a Christian evangelical, we're going to march forward to Jerusalem and defeat Islam thing that kind of makes it seem okay to invent weapons of mass destruction in the figment of one's imagination that don't necessarily exist. Right now, the issue does seem to be that the American establishment's response to the Taliban is that they're worried about the sort of racial and gender diversity of their government, rather than worrying about the, I think, far more flagrant human rights abuses that have already begun and that seem as if predestined to continue on the basis of past performance. And this speaks to the sort of infection of a kind of CRT ideology embedding itself in, I'm not saying in all of the Pentagon, but in enough of the institution that I feel no more inclined to trust it now than I do 20 years ago on the merits. I don't see a great move towards transparency, clear thinking, realpolitik combined with, I suppose, basic democratic values.
I think it's maybe even worse than that, Gabriel, which is the idea that part of the problem in Vietnam, I think, was that the terrible images of war were beamed into American living rooms, and that is what allowed public opinion to be turned. So that would have been less of a factor probably in the Second World War, where communications technology was not quite as advanced and the powers that be were more willing to censor news. By the time of Vietnam already, that was much more difficult. Those images were coming, in color, in plentiful reporting from the newspapers and photographs and so on into the living rooms. And today that's even more pronounced because now you've got even more communication channels, which are even more uncontrollable. And I think it is the case that not only is there the risk that governments lie to their people, but also that basically any actor is able to shape the narrative if they use these tools skillfully enough. And so you've got sort of the governments not being trusted, all sorts of news floating around, seeming equally plausible. And that really makes it very difficult to create some sort of rallying around the flag or sentiment that would support interventionism. It's easy to counter that nowadays.
So just on the point Frans made about how many American troops are in Iraq, I have just looked it up. It is precisely 2,500. So the same as the numbers that were in Afghanistan. And that Joe Biden has announced a withdrawal of the American combat mission in Iraq by the end of this year, after in April, American Central Command saying there wouldn't be no total withdrawal of US troops from Iraq. So we'll see if there's a second chapter to the Afghanistan story in December, although I doubt it, but you never know. All right, so let's close
Can
up
I
this
ask
discussion.
France a question? Before...
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, France and John. So if you guys are pushing back against the Henry Kissinger thesis, and let's just say the thesis is again, in a China sense, is that can be refined. So the opening idea, and in this regard, Kissinger and Fukuyama seem to be very much on the same boat, is that it's like inevitable if you secure free markets that what will follow is democratic constitutional democracy. And it's inevitable once you've got a free market constitutional democracy that it's just going to stay that way. It's never going to regress. That kind of inevitability thesis, a kind of Hegelian, the arc of history bends necessarily one way because the spirit flows above the world. That's got to be wrong. One always should have known that was wrong because it's spooky. It sort of makes it seem like there's a ghost in the machine. But the more limited thesis is, reframe it. The Crouse Kitchen's thesis is something like this: the best odds, the best chance you can take, is to secure a free market and then give it time. And in the case of
Gabriel,
isn't that the best that they could have done? And isn't that exactly the progress that they were achieving in Afghanistan? It was not ideal, but it was step for step. And if they'd had another 20 years, it would have been better still.
That's clear to me. You can't use the free markets and the like to appease the erstwhile ideologues into becoming something else, which was the attempt on China. You've got to suppress the erstwhile ideologues and keep them down, and then your thesis works a bit better. But you can't appease a determined, aggressive, ideological revolutionary. They've got to be taken out of the game, and then those institutions can be established, and you must just support them, which is what the amazing progress Afghanistan made in 20 years. And if all these people say, get out of Afghanistan, it's terrible, would you go and live there to those people who say that, who say it on sort of social justice type grounds, that this is permanent war and American military might thrown around the world? Would you rather live in Kabul with the Americans up the road at the air base in Bagram controlling things, or would you like to move there today when they've left? And that's settled. So just keep the ideological henchmen down, and then plant those institutions, and over a very long period of time they'll take hold. But you can't use the institutions to appease the henchmen. Keep the henchmen out of the way so the people learn to value and protect and engage with and enjoy those institutions. That's how I would alter your thesis, and then I think it's perfect.
Great.
John, anything to add before we close down?
I'd go along with France. So I think, and also with Gabriel. So I think the markets are very important, but not enough by themselves, because ultimately the ideas are what really matters, and you need to engage in the battle of ideas in order to achieve lasting change. If you just have markets only, it's not quite enough.
So France, I'm going to ask this last question, I guess, to everyone. I'll start with you, France. With everything that's just kind of been laid out, how do free societies win? If there's going to be yet another great clash between free societies and authoritarian societies later in the 21st century, how do we make sure that free societies win?
Without the willingness of Americans to use their military might to secure those victories, I think all bets are off. We were saved, the world, from fascism in Europe by American military might, and that was necessary, the threat thereof at least, to defeat communism and radical Islam more recently. And if that is absent and is not a pawn that can be employed, then I think the prospects for the world's less free regimes, and the three in the main, Iran, Russia, China, things there look better. So I think you have real reason to be worried that this time that same story of the past 100 and something years is not repeated, because America withdraws into its enclave, as it were. And because it's internally divided, cannot find common ground on national security policy, does not resort again to the great strength of its military and its economy to force freedom around the world where freedom is threatened. Like,
Gabriel, same question, but with the added element of, my favorite thing to bring up in this discussion, is India going to save us?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very good way to put it. I think that here's a segue to India from what Frans said. Let's notice that that Bush's best ally in some regards in going to Afghanistan was Vladimir Ilyich Putin. Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. Russia and America collaborated very closely in the Middle Eastern theater in the 2000s. The hotline between Bush and Putin rivaled the hotline between Bush and Tony Blair. Russia and America as allies. That is so far in the rearview mirror that I think it's hard to remember. And now Russia seems to stand on the other side of the equation. I'm not so sure that Russia doesn't come back to its former position by the time you get through the end of this isolationist cycle. It is, after all, a democracy and very plugged in to Moscow is plugged into Berlin much more than it is into Beijing. But that is the kind of, it's those B power questions that I think become important during this period of relative isolationism. What is going on with the French Foreign Legion? What is going on with German capacity? Japan's major change during the Afghan period, the last 20 years, has been to amend its constitution to allow more active military intervention. That's going to matter, especially if you look in the Far Eastern theater, Chinese cabbage patch sort of policy of growing things along. I think this is all to say that we've seen a great shift in the balance of forces. We've seen countries kind of change sides. And I think we are going to see more of that going forward. I don't really know. My concluding remark is just that France is absolutely right. If America doesn't play ball, the rest of the world can kind of hold up liberal constitutional democracy for a while, but it doesn't have enough. America is the largest economy. It has the military might. It has the history. It has the geostrategic positioning. It really is the case that we need it to perform better. And I think that if it is going to focus internally, what it needs to do is write its systems to rejuvenate meritocracy and put itself in a position that's more competitive on all fronts, so that by the end of this isolationist cycle, it's better positioned to re-enter on a stronger footing, or to regrow where it already is in a more sane, reasonable way. And that just seems to be the opposite of what's going on. America seems to be retreating and weakening and going more wobbly or loopy all at the same time. And so if there is a hope, I do think it's an inspiration from the outside. And India being the largest democracy on earth, India being the great counter-argument to the Little Englanders of the 1800s. England really was the reason that the Little Englanders never quite won the argument. Sorry, India. Because they were like, this place is too big, it's too rich, it's too interesting, it's too full of promise to give up on. I think India might I think it's a great place to look for some inspiration leading into the 21st century, and it strides both Pakistan, Afghanistan, and the Middle East, and Beijing to its east. So here's holding thumbs that they get their act together, that they continue to get their act together in a progressive way, in the Kissingerian sense of not getting it all right immediately, but being patient enough to go step for step in the direction of constitutional democracy and free markets.
Of course, India's quite an interesting power geopolitically, because it actually has friendly relations with both Iran and Russia, but very hostile relations with China, which means that it maybe, if this, I'm doubtful, but maybe if this pivot of Russia going the other way were to happen, it might happen because of India in some way.
Yeah, no, that's the only way it would, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
John, last words to you, sir.
Okay, so I'm going to inject another note of optimism and hope, which is that you're right, America and the United States off at your peril. And I think the great strength of the United States has always been its ability to reinvent itself, to be innovative, to get itself out of trouble. And that is something I'm sort of hoping for. I think it is in a bit of a hole at the moment, but I do hope that it will rediscover those qualities that have made that nation so great and find ways to reinvent itself and to come out stronger on the other end. And I think it might well do that, maybe in the face of a threat or a crisis. There'll be another rallying around the flag, and America will come back stronger than ever before, hopefully.
So that point, I think, is really good. If you were an American in 1978, looking at the world, you'd probably come to some similar analyses that we've just come to. And yet what was right around the corner? Well, a whole bunch of things: victory in the Cold War, etc., etc. So, yeah, as Frans often points out, the future is very difficult to determine. Thank you, gentlemen. I think this has been a really interesting discussion. We hope that our listeners have found it interesting too. Please support the Institute of Race Relations and the Daily Friend, which give you this sort of musings, thought, analysis content. You can SMS your name to 32823. You're still here after this long discussion. We salute you very much, and we'd love to hear your feedback. Anyway, thank you very much, everyone, and we will see you soon on the Daily Friend Show. Cheers, everyone.